Welcome to Rainbow Valley Resource Network's fall presentation. RVRN has been supporting Christian scientists with special needs for nearly 40 years. Our speaker, Michael Mooslin, also has been an advocate for those with disabilities. During his decades as a business leader, Mr. Mooslin provided training and employment opportunities to people in his community. He also lobbied Congress to include language in the Americans with Disabilities Act to allow them to be paid fairly for their work. Now, as a journalistic Christian Science practitioner, Mr. Mooslin devotes his full time to the public practice of healing. His talk is entitled, Seeing the Fellow Saint of a Holy Household. We hope you enjoy.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be with you today to speak on a subject really dear to my heart, seeing every individual as a fellow saint of a holy household. Let me start by reading a review of an art installation at the entrance to Mass MoCA, the Contemporary Art Museum in West Adams, Massachusetts. And I'm quoting now. "Hey, look at those upside down trees," one friend said to another. The trees turned out to be a work of art by Natalie Jeremichenko called Tree Logic, in which 6 live trees are inverted and suspended upside down from a truss made up of a metal armature, stainless steel planters, and telephone poles. In Tree Logic, the art of the piece is not found in its condition at any single point, but in the change of the trees gradually over time. Trees are dynamic natural systems, and Tree Logic reveals this dynamism. The familiar, almost iconic shape of the tree in nature is the result of the interplay between gravitropic and phototropic forces. In other words, the tree grows away from the earth and towards the sun. But when inverted, the 6 trees in this experiment still grow away from the earth and towards the sun, bending up. So the natural predisposition of trees might well produce the most unnatural shapes over time, raising questions about what the nature of natural is. That's the end of the quote. Another example of natural tendencies occurred years ago during a severe 10-year drought in California's Mojave Desert. There was concern that the seeds of the annual desert blooms had died. They generally do after about 7 years or so. However, the following year, there was a rain, and lots of it, flooding the desert floor. Sure enough, the following spring, the blooms returned. In the Bible, we read about the scent of water in the book of Job. Reading now. "For there is a hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, that the tender branches thereof will not cease. Though the root thereof wax old in the earth, and the stalk thereof die in the ground, yet through the scent of water it will bud, and bring forth boughs like a plant." The dormant seeds were drawn as by an irresistible attraction by just the scent of water. So please indulge me as I repeat a story I shared at one of the nursing conferences and in a more recent Sentinel article. Now, you're all familiar with the healing of the man with the withered hand. And I love this painting I saw at the Brooklyn Museum by James Tissot. The man must have been very self-conscious, hiding his deformed hand in the wide sleeve of his robe and perhaps holding it behind his back as he mingled in society. What did Jesus do? He called the man out in the midst of onlookers and made him show his hand to everyone. His words were, "Stretch forth thine hand," and resulted in the man's natural perfection revealing itself as Jesus called it forward. He saw the man's forward progress as natural and normal. Now, Let me tell of a contemporary version. The story shows how discerning the truth about a person's spiritual identity destroys the material falsehood labeling that person, providing the scent of water or a natural attraction to the light. I was president of a national fast food chain with about 12,000 employees. I was spending a lot of time at one particular restaurant trying to implement some new systems. One day, a developmentally challenged young man named Eugene applied for work with his social worker or job coach at his side. And in addition to some noticeable physical impairments, he had one closed, paralyzed hand and a claim by a social worker of a very low functioning IQ. The manager was put off by it and politely turned him away. And knowing that great companies are made up of special employees, I decided to step in and personally talk to Eugene. I observed in him qualities of value that could qualify him for some needed tasks. I loved his eagerness and his smile and a sense of excitement. I instructed the manager to give him a try. At first, the staff was upset, standoffish, and uncomfortable. But over time, they warmed up to Eugene and his wonderful smile and helpful, eager attitude. We saw less of the label of disability and more of who he was as a person. As we did this, he started to take on some more difficult tasks in contradiction to the claim of a low functioning IQ. About 6 months went by and I was visiting the restaurant again, and Eugene came up to me to show me that his hand was opening up as he could use it now. The paralysis was disappearing. You see, Eugene was responding to how he was being viewed and treated. About 2 years later, however, I got word that Eugene, now a much loved and valued employee, had given notice and he was leaving us. I couldn't believe it. I drove to the restaurant to find out what happened. He explained that his father, who operated a shoe repair store, had passed on, and he was leaving to run the business and support his mother. His low IQ, as well as his closed hand, was a thing of the past. Now, while not a Christian Science healing per se, this event had a profound impression on me. His improvement was a direct result of the entire staff's concept of Eugene. When that changed, Eugene changed. Eugene ceased to be a developmentally disabled employee and was simply an employee, a friend, an equal. Perfection was true of Eugene, and it is, of course, true of every client served by Rainbow Valley. I had to identify correctly my beautiful friend, Eugene, unlimited by the false label of disability, and see his natural trend toward the scent of water and the light. This experience inspired me to implement a hiring program I called Hire and Hire, H-I-R-E and H-I-G-H-E-R. And I joined the board of a particular group called Elwyn, the Elwyn Institute. They operate sheltered workshops in Southern California and Pennsylvania. And I then raised about $200,000 from our major competitors like McDonald's and Jack in the Box. And I built a fast food restaurant within the sheltered workshop, which I dubbed the Good Helping Cafe. There we implemented a restaurant training program for workshop clients. The donor restaurant chains all agreed to hire the graduates. This mainstreaming of so-called disabled from the sheltered workshop to the public workplace is what ultimately led to my efforts to lobby Washington to change the law as it was applied unfairly to the disabled. Their healthcare benefits, I soon found out, were eliminated as soon as their earnings went above $270 a month. I was so upset by this, I flew to Washington to personally lobby several congressmen with the argument that tax takers could be turned into taxpayers, and hundreds of thousands of workers could be hired in positions that were not being currently filled. All they needed to do was raise the earnings threshold and preserve the healthcare benefits. I found one congressman willing to listen, and we were successful in passing a 2-year demonstration project that raised the earnings threshold to $780 a month. Our success in changing that law led to over 200,000 jobs for the developmentally challenged. The bill was renewed 7 times and finally became a permanent law in the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, we're all familiar with Mary Baker Eddy's statement that we must look deep into realism instead of accepting only the outward sense of things. My grandmother used to love to tell the story of a little girl who attended a Christian Science Sunday school. She hurt her finger playing at school and went to the nurse's office, and they bandaged it up. Her father wasn't a Christian Scientist, and she was nervous that when she came home, he'd take her to a doctor. And she hid her hand behind, and her father wanted to look at it, and she came forward and said, "Oh, Daddy, please don't see what you're going to be looking at." You know, we can often be fooled by what we're looking at. Instead, we have to focus on the divine actuality of our being. So here's a story that I heard that illustrates her point. It's about masterpieces being lost forever when the owners covered them up by painting another scene over the original painting to keep the work of art from being taken, maybe to avoid taxes or hide them from the Germans during World War II, or painted over by art thieves to hide their crime. One collector who searched out these hidden masterpieces looked for hints in the framing and on the backs of the canvases, and he bought one such painting that had potential at an art auction. He then went to work on seeing if he could remove the amateur painting from atop the masterpiece that he suspected might be underneath. You see, oil paint never really dries, it just has different levels of hardness. So the newer painting was softer than the original, and he gently and laboriously rubbed off the fresher paint with a mild solution and a soft brush to discover that in fact there existed a signature of one of the great masters underneath. Now, I don't know who it was, but for the sake of the story, let's say it was Rembrandt's signature. So let me pose a question to all of you. If you owned that partially revealed Rembrandt, would you concern yourself with the nature or subject matter of the painting covering the Rembrandt? What if it was a really beautiful painting that you just loved? Would that matter? Of course not. What if it was an ugly picture? Would it distress you? No, it'd be irrelevant. Every time you looked at the painting, you would only focus on the process, however tedious, of revealing the original masterpiece underneath. Every time you thought about it, you'd be thinking about the masterpiece. Every free moment you had would be spent uncovering more of it. Well, Eugene's story revealed the masterpiece that he was. A while back, my wife and I went to see a play called Seminar by Teresa Rebeck, and it starred Jeff Goldblum. And I want to read a quote of his in the playbill that really jumped off the page at me. Goldblum asked, "How does fear and its related egotisms hold you back from being your true and truly alive self? Are you ready for the heroic struggle to overcome it and live beyond it?" You may have heard of the famed architect, engineer, and inventor of the geodesic dome, Buckminster Fuller. Fuller once said, "You're fulfilling your own significance if you apply yourself to the highest advantage of others." So living beyond a heroic struggle and applying yourself to the highest advantage of others is echoed by Mary Baker Eddy when she said the following, and I'll read it from retrospection for you. "I long to live and to see love demonstrated. I am seeking and praying for it to inhabit my own heart and to be made manifest in my life. Who will unite with me in this pure purpose and faithfully struggle till it be accomplished? I think Mrs. Eddy may have seen that play. Also, Eddy asks in her autobiography, Retrospection and Introspection, something else that relates to what we're talking about. And she writes, "Art thou still unacquainted with thyself? Then be introduced to this self. Note well the falsity of this mortal self. Behold its vileness, and remember this poverty-stricken stranger that is within thy gates. Cleanse every stain from this wanderer's soiled garments. Wipe the dust from his feet and the tears from his eyes, that you may behold the real man, the fellow saint of a holy household," which of course is the title of this talk. Now, let's look at two more Bible examples to further this point. First will be the healing of the crippled woman who was bent over and permanently disabled for 18 years. The Bible reads, "And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years and was bowed together, and in no wise could lift up herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God." That's from Luke 13. Now, let me ask you a question. If you were, and honestly, if you or I saw that woman and she asked for help, wouldn't we have gone over to her, put our arm around her, sympathetic to her condition, and offered assistance? What did Jesus do? He called her to him. Thoughtless? Rude? Dispassionate? No. He never saw a disabled woman. That correct view of her enabled the healing to take place. In our textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, Mrs. Eddy writes, Jesus beheld in science the perfect man, who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. In this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness, and this correct view of man healed the sick. Notice that Mrs. Eddy says correct view, not corrected view. Jesus was not seeing a disability and then correcting it. He simply saw her perfection and nothing else. He saw the masterpiece, the fellow saint of a holy household. You see, shifting how we look at things does not involve praying that something will become nothing. Error always was nothing. It never had a somethingness in the first place. Error has no origin or beginning because it never was. Truth has no beginning because it always was. One more example, more akin to a developmental challenge. First, let's define that term. Developmental disability is a chronic condition due to mental or physical impairments, usually from birth. We all remember from John 9, an individual with such an impairment, and I'm referring to the blind man on the side of the road. It reads that as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from his birth. The disciples asked him, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now examine the slight but profound difference in the wording, being blind from birth and being born blind. The disciples saw a man that had come into the world already blind, born blind. Whereas Jesus saw a man who was blind from his birth only, not prior to his birth. His knowledge of man's original perfection, man's pre-existing perfect being, is what allowed him to heal the man. He saw the man's true being. Blindness, as ever having been part of the man's identity, was impossible. You know, there's 28 healing illustrations in the 4 versions of the gospel of Christ, and they share a number of common qualities. In most cases, they either called for the Christ, came to the Christ, or were called to him, as in the case of the woman. This coming to the Christ is an essential ingredient in healing. One also finds bowing before Christ, indicating a sea-deep humility and a sky-high hunger and thirsting for righteousness. Add the qualities of gratitude and obedience and expectancy, and you have a recipe for healing that these 28 examples illustrate and share. I mentioned Buckminster Fuller earlier in this talk. He was also the father of the theory of synergistics, emphasizing the unpredictable behavior of any isolated component, including humanity's role as both participant and observer, and how it affects the whole system. In his thousands of lectures, Fuller urged his audiences to study synergistics, saying, "I'm confident that humanity's survival depends on all of our willingness to comprehend feelingly the way nature works." You've all heard the term synergy. What it really means is when you introduce an observer into a situation, a conflict, or a scientific experiment, or the simple act of observation, and the outcome changes. This has been proven in physics experiments, business meetings, and social settings. Jesus healed by his correct observations, always seeing only the masterpiece. Of course, every Christian Science practitioner knows that the correct observation results in healing. Our correct spiritual Christly observation provides the synergy or scent of water that awakens the dormant thought, drawing thought like those upside down trees, trending irresistibly to the light. Another example of an effective observer is a Christian Science nurse. Before our Christian Science nurses enter a patient's room, they pause, they take a breath, and they wait for the Christ to precede them into the room. Their Christly observation is effective in changing the outcome without any physical manipulation and without saying a word. All healing is revelation of the Christ to human consciousness, resulting in the change to the outcome of case. Defined in the textbook of Christian Science, and you all know this, the Christ is the divine manifestation of God, which comes to the flesh to destroy incarnate error. Incarnate meaning in the body. Sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? If there's no matter, as Christian Science claims, then how does God's manifestation come to the material flesh if it doesn't really exist? Well, let me put it a different way. How does the sun, which drew those tree branches to it, evaporate water on a sidewalk? It doesn't know anything about the water, doesn't identify it, feel it, touch it, but its influence evaporates it nonetheless. Well, the Christly influence observed by the nurse or the practitioner has the same synergistic effect. Our leader tells us in miscellaneous writings that no evidence before the material senses can close my eyes to the scientific proof that God good is supreme. And no evidence before the material senses can shut our eyes to the masterpiece that is our life and the lives of every one of God's beloved children. Every individual is a masterpiece, the fellow saint of a holy household. Once God's masterpiece, man, starts revealing itself, we can never be impressed again by the human appearance. And to quote the last line of Eddie's book, Unity of Good, man cannot escape from identification with what dwelleth in the eternal mind. I'd like to close by reading a poem by Peter J. Henniker Heaton called Uncalendared. Man has no hour of birth, no natal moment when stars inclement can fasten upon him some dark, implacable fate. From before the world's foundation, he has held his station in the presence of God, individual, whole, complete. Man has no hour of death, no mortal minute that stores within it some physical program coded to drive him hence. Idea in infinite mind, having neither beginning nor end, man coexists with divine intelligence. Man does not come or go, but under love's care and favor, he lives forever. His spiritual substance, eternal, unimpaired, from horizon to horizon, each appearing in its season, he walks in spirit, unclocked, uncalendared. Thank you all very much.